U.S. President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris are set to make their first joint appearance on the campaign trail since she replaced him as the Democratic candidate. They've chosen the union-heavy city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania for their rally, which comes as the U.S. marks the National Labor Day holiday this Monday. Pennsylvania is also Biden's birth state and is one of a handful of swing states that could decide the election, which is now just over 2 months away. Monty Francis has more.
Kamala Harris spent the Labor Day holiday campaigning in 2 key states, Michigan and Pennsylvania. With just 2 months to go until Election Day, the Democratic nominee is trying to sway unions and blue-collar workers.
We celebrate unions because unions helped build America, and unions help build America's middle class.
There are at least 7 swing states, and for his part, Donald Trump and his running mate have events planned in Nevada, North Carolina, and Arizona this week. Over the weekend, the former president and Republican nominee held a rally in Pennsylvania where he lobbed personal attacks against his opponent.
If you look at Kamala and you look at what she's done to every place she's touched, has turned to
With the campaigns in high gear, they are now in the final stretch to Election Day. Early voting in some states begins this week on September 6th. On September 10th, Harris and Trump face off in their first and possibly only televised debate. Then on September 18th, attention turns back to Trump's legal issues when he's due in court to be sentenced in his New York hush money case, in which prison time could be a possibility. Meanwhile, polls show that for voters in the swing states, the economy remains their #1 concern. But polls also show that the issue of abortion is central to how they will cast their ballots.
Once we've seen our bodily autonomy go, what comes next?
My biggest fears is where the economy's going. Interest rates are at an all-time high.
On October 1st, vice presidential nominees Tim Walz and J.D. Vance will face off on the debate stage. All of this leading up to Election Day on November 5th.
Well, for some analysis on the current state of the race, we can bring in Miranda Yaver, a political scientist and assistant professor of health policy at the University of Pittsburgh. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, Pennsylvania is going to be one of the key states in this election. On average, polls there do show Harris with a slight lead, though Donald Trump still comes out on top in some surveys. Which candidate, being someone in Pennsylvania yourself, which candidate do you see as having the advantage there?
It's going to be very close, and I think it's safe to say that how Pennsylvania votes is going to determine the outcome of this election. You know, as you said on the front end of this segment, this is a very union-heavy state, and this is the most pro-union ticket that the Democrats have run, and it stands in stark contrast to what we've seen on the Republican side. So Kamala Harris and Joe Biden are here in Pittsburgh on Labor Day. We saw at the Democratic convention broad embrace of unions. And I think this is going to be really pivotal because, workers, the middle class, these are all groups that we need to succeed in America. And I think that the Democratic Party's messaging is going to speak to that, but it is going to be down to the wire. And early vote, Pennsylvania is an early voting state. We'll see what happens. What I have experienced in both sort of talking with people and actually doing a little bit of campaigning myself, as I've noticed that there has been a lot of receptivity both to Kamala Harris and to Tim Walz.
Now, Donald Trump, meanwhile, is having a pretty low-key Labor Day weekend. What do you think is going to be his main campaign strategy in the coming months?
So I think it's safe to say that that the Republican Party is going to lean very heavily on immigration. One of the things that we're seeing in Pennsylvania and in other parts of the country where there are these pivotal states and where the polls are close is that the Republicans have started to run an ad against Kamala Harris about an immigrant who committed a crime and basically trying to attach that to Kamala Harris's policies. This is a strategy that we saw in 1988 with a campaign ad about someone named Willie Horton, led by Lee Atwater. There isn't a whole lot of support to show that it actually affected the election, but these are strategies that we're seeing resurfacing. And it is a message that Republicans and independents tend to be receptive to. So I think we're going to see a lot of emphasis on crime and immigration. And it's no surprise that we're starting to see Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party pivot a little bit to the center on issues of immigration, because at the end of the day, independents are going to help decide the outcome of this election, and that means being able to speak across party lines.
And the Democrats have really been riding on a high since Kamala Harris took over as the candidate. How do you expect next week's debate to shift that dynamic, if at all?
Yeah, so, the political science literature up until, very recently was not of the necessarily of the opinion that debates are huge movers and shakers in elections. Obviously, that was not the case on June 27th. So this is going to be a big moment. Kamala Harris was a very good debater. She was very good on the Senate Judiciary Committee in interrogating witnesses. So the pressure's on her side. And then there's just sort of a question of to what extent Trump can be disciplined. That is not his strong point, to say the least. He is going to be muted between, when he's being asked questions, and so I think that will operate as a constraint on him. But the reality is that he needs the debate. Usually, you demand more debates when you're losing, and he eventually started pushing for more and more debates because he is struggling a bit in the polls, and so my expectation is that Kamala Harris is going to do quite well, but this is not an election short of surprises. So we'll see. One of the other issues that is really important to emphasize in this election is just the extent to which so many of the issues on the ballot really do transcend party lines, because this isn't so much an election about policy. This is really an election about democracy. And so one thing that I will really be looking for is questions that center on these issues of democracy, respect for transitions of power, and voting rights.
Absolutely could not be higher. Miranda Yaver, thank you again so much for your analysis today. That's Miranda Yaver, a political scientist and assistant professor of health policy at the University of Pittsburgh.
Thanks so much for having me.